The police arrived at the funeral home at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning. Not to pay their respects, there were two of them, plain clothes. The kind of arrival that looks unremarkable until you notice that they're not signing the condolence book and they're not looking at the flowers. They're looking at a woman in a black dress standing by the casket, accepting hugs from people who are telling her how sorry they are. Her name was Sandra Holt. She was 44 years old. She had been married to Philip Holt for 16 years. She had spent the last 4 months watching him get weaker, watching with what his children, his colleagues, and most of his friends had interpreted as the specific anguish of a devoted wife. What they didn't know, what Sandra did not know anyone knew, was that Philip Holt had not died from the neurological condition his doctors had initially suspected, and that the toxicology report that had come back 48 hours ago had identified something in his system that had no business being there, and that Philip Holt, 6 months before he died, had walked into his solicitor's office and changed his will completely, not because he was afraid of dying, but because he was afraid of what his wife was doing to him, and he had decided to be very, very careful about how he handled what he knew. The detective leading the investigation had a copy of that new will in his jacket pocket. He crossed the funeral home floor. He said, "Sandra Holt?" She turned. She looked at him. And in the half-second before her expression arranged itself into something appropriate, he saw it. The specific micro-expression of someone who has just understood that a plan has failed. "I'm Detective Harris," he said. "I need you to come with me. Let me take you back to where this started. Because this story is about more than a crime. It's about a man who saw what was coming, kept his silence, and made sure the truth would speak for itself. This story is going to keep building from here, and you need to be here for every second of it. Like this video right now. Those likes matter more than most people realize. Subscribe to, free, 2 seconds. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Now let's go back 6 months. Philip Holt was 62 years old and had spent 4 decades building a commercial property business that now operated across 3 regions and employed over 200 people. He was not a dramatic man. He did not tell stories at dinner parties or dominate rooms with his personality. He was the kind of man who showed up early, read documents carefully, asked the question nobody else thought to ask, and made decisions that were slower than other people preferred and almost always correct. His first wife, Carol, had died 11 years ago. Cancer, swift and terrible. They had 2 children together, a son named James, 31, who worked in the company's operations division, and a daughter named Rachel, 28, who was a teacher in the city. Philip had met Sandra 3 years after Carol's death, at a charity event. She was warm and articulate, and seemed genuinely interested in him as a person rather than as a company. He had been cautious. He was always cautious. But he had also been lonely in the specific way that capable, self-sufficient people are lonely when they have organized their life so completely that there's no room left in it for surprise. He had married her after 2 years of careful dating. For the first 8 years, he had no significant complaints. Then his father died and left him an estate worth £7 million, on top of what he had already built. And something in Sandra shifted. Not dramatically. These things never shift dramatically. It was the small things first. A new interest in the estate's legal structure. Questions about inheritance tax planning that came dressed as practicality. A growing preoccupation with what happened to everything if something happened to Philip. Philip noticed. He was a man who noticed things and said nothing until he understood what he was noticing. The weakness started in February. Philip had always been healthy, an active man, walked every morning, ate sensibly, had the constitution of someone who had never given his body particular reason to malfunction. So when the fatigue started arriving in February, heavy, inexplicable, the kind that sleep didn't fix, he went to his doctor, who ran tests and found nothing conclusive. He went back in March, more tests, a specialist referral. The specialist mentioned possibilities, a neurological issue, possibly autoimmune, and ordered further investigation. By April, Philip had lost 12 pounds and was having episodes of dizziness so severe he had to sit down abruptly wherever he was standing. What the doctors were looking for, they had not yet found. What Philip had started looking for himself was something different. It started with a calendar discrepancy. He was having a good afternoon, one of the clearer ones, and he noticed that a small supplement Sandra had started adding to his evening tea 3 months ago had arrived in the post on a date that precisely corresponded with the onset of his symptoms. He said nothing to Sandra. He set the supplement aside. He told her he had switched to a different brand. He watched. Over 2 weeks, he felt incrementally better. He took the supplement to a private laboratory and paid for a full chemical analysis. The results came back on a Friday morning. He read them at his office desk with the door closed, and then he sat for a long time looking at the wall. The supplement contained a compound that did not appear on its label, a heavy metal compound that, in sustained doses over weeks and months, produced exactly the symptoms Philip had been experiencing. It was not instantly fatal. It was the kind of thing that could look, over time, like a deteriorating neurological condition. The kind of thing that a good doctor, looking at the right symptoms in the right patient, might eventually attribute to natural causes. Philip understood what he was looking at. He also understood that if he went to the police immediately, Sandra would lawyer up and the evidence chain would be complex. He needed to be careful. He needed to be patient. He called his solicitor that afternoon. Philip Holt spent 6 months conducting what could only be described as the most methodical, careful, and disciplined private investigation of his own situation that any person has ever conducted. He did not confront Sandra. He did not change his behavior toward her in any visible way. He took the tea she made him and disposed of it privately. He ate her cooking selectively, with the quiet paranoia of a man who had become certain that his instinct was correct and was willing to be wrong about every other interpretation of the data before accepting that conclusion. He also kept a journal, not a private diary. He knew that could be found, a formal dated witness document log stored with his solicitor that recorded every observation, the supplement, the lab results, the dates of his worst symptoms and their correlation with specific beverages, the dates he stopped consuming the supplement and the gradual improvement he felt. He changed his will. The original will had left the majority of the estate to Sandra, with a provision for James and Rachel. The new will left the estate entirely to James and Rachel, with a specific annotation, a sealed letter to his solicitor to be opened upon his death, explaining what he had found and requesting that the appropriate authorities be notified. He had one conversation with James, brief, in the car driving back from a site visit where he was certain they weren't overheard. He said, "If something happens to me, call Detective Harris directly. Here's his number. Don't go through any other channel, just him. Tell him to open the letter." James had looked at his father. "Dad, I'm handling it," Philip said. "Just remember the number." James memorized it. Philip continued going home to his wife every evening, sitting at the dinner table, watching television, being exactly the man she thought she had managed. The cancer was real. That was the brutal irony. In October, 4 months after Philip had changed his will, 3 months after the private laboratory results, a scan taken as part of the ongoing specialist investigation found a tumor, pancreatic, aggressive. The consultant was as honest as consultants are trained to be about what aggressive pancreatic cancer means for Timeline. Philip received this news on a Thursday afternoon and drove home and sat in his car outside his house for 20 minutes. Then he went inside and had dinner with his wife and did not tell her. He called James that evening. "I have cancer," he said, "the real kind, completely separate from the other thing. I'm going to die, James. The question is what happens after I do." James was unable to speak for a moment. "The letter is with Malcolm at the solicitor's office," Philip said. "Make sure it gets opened. Don't let Sandra near the estate administration." "Dad, I know," Philip said. "I know." The next 3 months were the ones that Rachel would describe, later, as the most disorienting of her life. Because from the outside, Sandra was the perfect, devoted wife. She sat at Philip's bedside. She spoke to the doctors. She organized the house around his needs. She cried at the right moments with the specific visibility of someone who knew they were being witnessed. And Philip, who knew what she was, who had documented what she had done, who had rearranged his entire estate against her, was unfailingly kind to her throughout. James asked him about this once. "Why are you being nice to her?" he said, not angry, genuinely bewildered. Philip considered it. "Because anger takes energy I don't have," he said, "and because I've already done everything that needed doing. There's nothing left for anger to accomplish." He died on a Monday morning in November, at home, with James and Rachel beside him. Sandra was in the room too. Philip said nothing to her in the end. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he had decided, long ago, that the truth would speak louder than anything he could say, and it would speak at the right time and in the right room. He was correct. Like this video. If Philip's story is blowing your mind right now, that like button is the least you can do. Hit it. Subscribe if you haven't, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Now we're at the part you've been waiting for. Malcolm, Philip's solicitor, opened the sealed letter the morning after Philip died. He read it twice. Then he called Detective Harris. Detective Harris had been in his position for 19 years and had handled cases of domestic poisoning on 3 previous occasions. He read Philip's letter and the attached documentation, the laboratory results, the dated journal entries, the timeline correlation, with the expression of a man who is looking at a case that has already been built for him. "He did our job for us," he said to his partner. He ordered a full toxicology panel on Philip's remains, which the death certificate had not yet been finalized without, and which the initial coroner's assessment had flagged as potentially unusual, but inconclusive, pending the specialist's neurological investigation. The toxicology results took 48 hours. They confirmed what Philip's private laboratory had found 6 months earlier: the heavy metal compound, in quantities consistent with sustained administration over approximately 4 months, combined with the pancreatic cancer, which the toxicology confirmed had been entirely separate. The compound had accelerated Philip's decline significantly. Without it, the consultant estimated, Philip might have had an additional 6 to 8 months. Sandra had not given him cancer, but she had taken time from him, and she had meant to take everything else. Detective Harris called Malcolm on a Tuesday morning. He asked about the will. Malcolm confirmed that the estate, the company, the property portfolio, the personal assets, the inheritance from Philip's father had been restructured 6 months ago. James and Rachel were the sole beneficiaries. Sandra received nothing beyond what she had brought into the marriage. "She doesn't know?" Harris asked. "The new will was not disclosed to her," Malcolm said. "Philip's specific instruction was that it not be. So she went through all of this, without knowing she would receive nothing." "Yes," Malcolm confirmed. Harris was quiet for a moment. "The letter says he knew she was poisoning him," he said. "He didn't go to the police at the time. He documented it and waited." "Why?" "He felt the evidence needed to be airtight," Malcolm said. "He was a methodical man." Harris thought about Philip Holt, a man who had found out his wife was poisoning him, had sat across from her at dinner every evening for 6 months with that knowledge, and had responded by building an unassailable case rather than losing his composure. "He was more than methodical," Harris said. The funeral had been arranged for the Tuesday. Sandra had organized it. She had chosen the flowers, the readings, the reception venue. She had accepted condolences with the practiced grief of someone who had been preparing for this day, and all it represented, for some time. She was standing by the casket when Detective Harris and his partner crossed the funeral home floor. She turned when he said her name. She saw his face. She saw behind him a uniformed officer holding a document, and in the fraction of a second between his words and her processing of them, in that small, unguarded moment, James saw her face from across the room. He saw the calculation. Not grief, calculation. The expression of a person running numbers that have suddenly stopped adding up. "Sandra Holt," Detective Harris said, "I'm arresting you on suspicion of administering a noxious substance with intent to harm. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention something which you later rely on in court." The funeral home went completely, absolutely silent. Sandra said nothing, but her hands, the hands that had been folded in front of her, the hands that had made Philip's tea every evening for 4 months, her hands started to shake. Rachel, standing near the wall, watched the officers walk her stepmother out of the room. Then she looked at James. He was crying, not from grief. He had done most of his grieving in the 3 months he'd known this was coming. He was crying because his father had been right, and because being right about something like this was its own particular devastating kind of victory. The trial took 11 months. Philip's documentation was, as Detective Harris had initially assessed, one of the most complete private evidence sets he had encountered. The dated journal, the laboratory results, the correlation timeline, the private testimony of the consultant who had treated Philip, who confirmed that the compound's presence was medically consistent with deliberate administration. The defense argued natural deterioration. They argued the compound's presence could be explained by other means. They argued that Philip's documentation reflected the paranoia of a sick man rather than observed fact. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Sandra Holt was convicted of administering a noxious substance with intent to harm. The judge, in sentencing, noted the sustained nature of the offense and the deliberate concealment, and handed down a sentence of 8 years. She appealed. The appeal failed. The estate was administered exactly as Philip had intended. James and Rachel handled it together. The company, the properties, the trust Philip had established in his final months for a charity that supported neurological research, which James said was his father's specific quiet humor about the whole situation. Malcolm read them the section of Philip's letter that had not been submitted to the police, the personal section, written to James and Rachel directly. It said, "I want you to know that I was not afraid. I was angry for about 3 days when I understood what was happening, and then I decided that anger was a waste of the time I had left. What I felt after that was love, for both of you, for your mother's memory, for the company we built together, and the one I hope you will keep building. Don't let this define how you see people. It is one person's failure, not a lesson about human nature. Most people are not Sandra. Most people are worth trusting. I need you to keep believing that. Your father." James read it 3 times. Rachel kept the original. Philip Holt knew his wife was poisoning him and said nothing to her for 6 months. He sat at dinner with her. He accepted her concern. He watched her perform the role of devoted wife while he documented, quietly and precisely, everything she was doing. He did this because he believed that building an unassailable case was more important than confronting her, because he knew that confrontation would give her time to destroy evidence and lawyer up, because he had calculated, with the same methodical care he brought to every business decision, that patience was the most powerful tool available to him. And he was right. But here is the question I want you to sit with. Was it right to say nothing to the police at the time? Should Philip have gone to the authorities the moment he had the lab results, even if the case was less complete? Or do you think what he did was the only way to guarantee justice? And the harder one, could you sit across a dinner table from someone you knew was trying to kill you and say nothing? Tell me in the comments. Real answers only, and drop where you're watching from. Like this video. If Philip's story stayed with you, that like button is right there and it takes 1 second and it matters. Share it. Subscribe if you're not already. See you in the next one.